We will assume that we'll just start filming now. Ordinarily, I give a few opening statements and then give you a very quick break. We'll get started now, since we're starting a little late. We'll still give the candidates as much time as they need. Well, not as much time as they need, but we'll give 45 minutes for the event. I'd like to remind everybody to turn off your electronic devices, your phones. Look at you all leaning down. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Your phones, your pagers, if you still got them, your tablets, your computers, all those things. We ask that there be no t-shirts, no buttons, no campaign literature inside this room, but your candidates are welcome to put things outside the room. The library is going to be live streaming tonight, and so that doesn't really apply to any of you here. Since you're already here, it is a live stream, 3D, high def. But if you'd like to see it again, you may go on the library's website and see the proceedings. I am Enid Weichselbaum. I'm a longtime member of the League of Women Voters in Rochester. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, candidates, the audience, anybody who's watching on the streaming service. This forum is presented by the League, and we would like to thank our partners tonight, the Rochester Public Library, the Rochester Post-Bulletin, and the Rochester Chamber of Commerce. The League of Women Voters is a volunteer organization organized at the local, the state, and national level to encourage citizens to participate in government. While we as a league do study and take stands on certain issues, we never endorse or support political parties or candidates, and this is an entirely nonpartisan event tonight. The views expressed in the forum are those of the candidates, not those of the league, or any partner or sponsor of this forum, and the sponsorship of the forum is not an endorsement of a candidate. It is our purpose in sponsoring this forum to provide you with the opportunity to hear candidates discuss face-to-face issues that are important to you. Tonight's questions have come from the League, the LWV Rochester, the Post-Bulletin, the Chamber of Commerce, the members of our audience. You are welcome to submit as many questions as you wish. At the back table, you'll find note cards. They may have already been handed to you. If you have a question, write it down as clearly as you can. Hold it up. A volunteer will fetch it and review it. Tonight's volunteers that are reviewing the questions are also LWV volunteers. Questions that are unclear, are hostile, or of a personal nature will not be used. Given our format, your questions must relate to both candidates. Questions that fall in the same general area or which have been addressed in candidates' opening statements or previous questions may be consolidated to allow for more. We'd like to cover as many topics as possible. We appreciate that. We appreciate if your questions are not about the past but are in forward-looking terms. If the answer from the candidate is not clear to you, speak to the candidate after the forum, and I'm sure you'll get a clear answer. The question cards will become property of the League of Women Voters. There's never enough time to cover all the issues in a limited time. In settings such as this, feel free to contact the candidate's campaign headquarters directly if your questions are not addressed tonight. We'd like to thank the candidates for running for office. We know it takes a lot of time and energy to campaign and to serve, and so we appreciate your willingness to do that. We encourage each of you to get involved in the party of your choice with the candidates of your choice and to assist them in their campaigns. Tonight's forum, our first forum tonight, is for Senate District 26. The candidates are Carla Nelson and Richard Wright. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. When a question is asked, each candidate will have 1 minute for an answer. Each of the candidates has 3 rebuttal cards, indicating that you have 3 opportunities to make rebuttals, but you may only have 1 rebuttal per question, and you have 30 seconds for your rebuttal. I'd like to remind the audience to remain quiet during the forum. I want you to hold your applause till after the candidates are completely finished. Timekeeper tonight for League of Women Voters is Ione Schlegel. Questions will be screened by Amy Cockett, Cindy Swessel-Hofer, and Marilyn Moran, one of those people. Joining us from the Post Bulletin tonight is Heather Carlson, and from the Chamber of Commerce, Micah Johnson. I think that's all for the housekeeping, and we won't repeat this for every event tonight. We are ready for opening statements according to drawing Uno cards for numbers. Carla Nelson drew a lower number, so she will make her opening statement first. Again, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Well, good evening. I'm State Senator.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. All right. Good evening. I'm State Senator Carla Nelson, and I really want to thank the League, the Chamber, and the Post Bulletin for sponsoring today's, this evening's debate. These type of information meetings are important to our voters to help them as they go to the voting booth. I also thank you, members, for being here, audience members, and investing your time in learning more about your candidates. I'm a wife, a mother, a former teacher, and a small business owner. Those are things that have helped inform my work at the Capitol, along with what I've heard from each of you. One, we must have that strong economy. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about my efforts to make sure that our economy is vibrant in this area. We need to have an improved education system so that all of our students are prepared for the jobs of tomorrow. And I look forward to discussing that with you as well. And we must make sure we invest in our veterans and our seniors. These are all things that I was able to do as your state senator. Historic funding for education, long-term care funding for our nursing homes that was in dire need, and supporting our veterans, particularly by removing the Minnesota taxation on their pensions. I look forward to visiting with you tonight and look forward to working with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Can you guys see me okay sitting down? Is it better if I stand up or sit? What do you prefer? Okay.
Oh,
down?
no,
oh,
the library's asking you to
down.
sit because the video is fixed.
That's fine, so I'll sit down. So you'll have to adjust to see us then. Thank you to the League of Women Voters, the Post Bulletin, and the Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this event. And thank you to all of you who are sitting here to come and interact with us, and to all of you at home who are watching. I've knocked on a lot of doors, probably over 10,000. And the number one issue, besides the presidential race, the number one issue that I get asked by people is, how come our legislators can't get their work done up in St. Paul, and what are you going to do about it? Because people are frustrated. We didn't get a transportation bill, we didn't get a bonding bill, we didn't get tax relief, and then we have $900 million of our money sitting up there doing nothing when we have needs. And I guess the response I have is, I have 16 years of negotiating experience. A lot of that as a trial lawyer, so when I'm involved, it's bad. It's the end of an argument. It doesn't get more contentious, it doesn't get more polarized, it doesn't get more heated. Yet 98% of my cases settle. And that's because I work hard with my party or my client. So my party and client understand, hey, you're not going to get everything you want because life doesn't work that way. And at the same time, I always reach across the aisle to the other side in a respectful manner. And I ask, hey, what are your needs? Because these are my clients' needs. What are your solutions? These are my clients and my solutions. And let's start working together to hammer out a deal. And it works. If you're respectful, if you're patient, and if you're creative, it works. You can get a lot done. And I think we just need that, more people up there in St. Paul who know how to do that. We don't need more rules to tell us how to behave. What we need are actually people who can roll up their shirt sleeves, work together with people who have opposite opinions, and find solutions so that we can all move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question comes from the League, and we will begin with Mr. Wright. Political action committees and other independent spenders are infusing large sums of cash in election campaigns since the Citizens United decision. What changes to Minnesota campaign finance laws and practices are warranted in light of this trend?
Well, the first thing Citizens United unshackled dark money. Most of you probably know this, but just in case you don't, when the opinion came down, what it did is allowed money coming from unknown sources to go into PACs. The PACs don't have to report where those sources are, so it's anonymous, it's dark. We don't know where the funds are coming from. So what we need to do is we need to put a spotlight on that. And in Minnesota, we can do that. Any funds that are coming into the state, whether it be from PAC, anyone who's donating to a PAC should have to disclose that they're donating. Every PAC should have to disclose who their donors are, because otherwise we don't know where the money's coming from. And that dark money is a problem, because the way I see things, we can have people coming from different countries, donating funds to different corporations, like at the Cayman Islands, into a sub-fund into the US, and then can donate to a PAC. And we can't control that. The only way we can control it is if we start to open up, make the laws that you have to actually disclose. Thank you.
Thank
Would
you,
you
Ms.
repeat
Nelson.
the question,
I
please?
sure will. Political action committees and other independent spenders are infusing large sums of cash in election campaigns since the Citizens United decision. What changes to Minnesota campaign finance laws and practices are warranted in light of this trend?
Well, I share the concern about dark money, but I also believe that while much of what Attorney Wright talked about was at the federal level, we really don't want to bring federal politics to Minnesota. Let's focus on Minnesota and the Campaign Finance Board, and so I appreciate that aspect of the question. Within the laws that have been passed at the Supreme Court level nationally, I can tell you what I think would be helpful in the state of Minnesota. We do need to have that disclosure, but it does need to be the same for everyone. We should not have unlevel playing fields. So just like PACs, if PACs disclose, so should unions disclose where their funding comes from. So I think that we need to have a level playing field, whatever we do, whether we're talking about dark money or anything else. It's always important to look at having a level playing field.
Thank you. Our next question is an LWV question. And we'll begin with Ms. Nelson. The Minnesota tax system has moved from progressive income taxes to more regressive property taxes in recent years. What is your philosophy on taxation?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I do sit on the tax committee. Taxes need to be fair, transparent, and equitable. Our current tax system is really not so much in that way. Regarding property taxes, which are regressive, as is the gasoline tax, by the way, very regressive taxation, I supported things to help relieve property taxes, such as the tax bill that was vetoed this year by the governor that included hundreds of millions of dollars of tax relief, particularly in the forms of LGA going to cities and CPA going to counties. My opponent said that he would have voted against that. That is a vote against property tax relief. Those are determined at the state or at the local level, except for the 30% that is tacked on at the state to all commercial properties. That is something that the state adds to the regressive taxation, and it actually makes Minnesota a more costly state in which to do business.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Senator Nelson's absolutely correct. I would have voted against that tax bill. Our senators got that tax bill about 2 minutes before the bell rang. No one had time to read it. No one knew what was in it. As an attorney, that's irresponsible to vote for a bill that you don't know what's in it. No one knew it. And as a result, it had a $100 million mistake in it. How is that responsible government? That's not. I would have voted no and told my leaders, give us more time to review the bill. As far as tax policy, most people know I'm a progressive tax guy. Ms. Nelson and her tax and her stuff, she's more of a trickle-down economics. Those are two different types of tax policies. So for me, when we raised the taxes on the top 2%, that was progressive. Do you remember when we did that in 2013? And as a result, we actually have surpluses now. Ms. Nelson voted against that. And that's because she wanted to save the taxes on the top 2%. That trickle-down doesn't work for us.
I'll do a rebuttal, please.
Yes, for rebuttal.
Thank you. Let's clarify that 2013 tax bill. Yes, there was an increase on the upper 2%, but there were $1 billion of new taxes on businesses all across the state, commerce across the state, individuals, sales taxes on car leases, you name it, R&D about closed IBM, sent them about right out of this state. So that was very damaging. In fact, it was so incredibly damaging that for the first time in the history of our state, even the Democrats who had full control at that time came back and said, you know what, these taxes are so damaging, we are going to repeal some of them. I led that repeal effort, but let's clarify what that tax bill did include.
Thank you. The next question will come from the Post Bulletin. We'll begin with Mr. Wright.
Southeast Minnesota residents buying health insurance in the individual market face the highest premiums in the state. What should lawmakers do to address these rising insurance costs?
The rising insurance cost has been in the press a lot lately. And we've heard about scrapping MNsure and all that, but remember, MNsure is nothing more than a gateway. It's like Travelocity. Has no control over the cost of healthcare. There are some things that we can do, and the Senate had 6 items that they wanted to run through on the budget last year, but the Republicans voted all against them. One thing we can do, why not look at Minnesota as a block state? That increases the pool, that lowers the premiums for everybody. Another thing we can do, you know, the rising costs, 95% of our population receives health insurance through employers or through medical assistance. So it's 5% of our population we're talking about that are getting hit by these increasing costs. Half of those already receive some state assistance. Why not broaden the state assistance so we can make health insurance available for everyone and make it affordable? Because it's cheaper to do that than it is to pay for that ER bill for people who don't get preventative medicine.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson.
The rising costs are a great concern. Before the advent of the Affordable Care Act, misnamed, and Minnesota's version of it, MNsure, Minnesota actually had a market that was working for small businesses and individuals. In fact, we had a high-risk pool called MCHA that was working, and 26-year-olds could stay on their parents' health insurance policy. Those were supposedly the great things that the Affordable Care Act, or MNsure, were going to bring to us. Minnesota was already doing them. The government-induced crisis has led to a literal crisis in our state. We need to do several things. We need to have an equitable risk pool in this state. Where we have the highest premiums right here, we have the smallest risk pool in the state. We need to encourage county-based purchasing options. We should allow farmers and other businesses to become co-ops so that they can get those lower prices. And in the immediate future, we need to look at some tax credit as relief. But much of this, by the way, is come from the federal government, and we need to look for them for answers.
Thank you. Our next question comes from the Chamber of Commerce, and Ms. Nelson will begin.
Transportation has become a major area of contention in the legislature the past couple of sessions. How would you pay for bridges, roads, and transit, and how would you get these items through the legislature?
Transportation, that is one of the things that I think everyone agrees upon is so important. One of the things we need to do is make better use of the money we have. I think we also need to look at capturing transportation funds such as sales taxes on auto leases, on auto parts. That is, interestingly enough, a growing source of income. And we should be looking at tapping some of that to help pay for some of our roads and bridges. We have more roads and bridges than just about any other part of the state. So those things would be important. We also need to look at a robust bonding package for roads and bridges, bridges particularly. I can tell you I voted for the largest transportation funding for our roads and bridges. It got derailed at the last minute because, quite frankly, in the Senate, it was in the Senate, but it was every Democrat that stood up to add a light rail amendment to that extensive transportation and bonding bill, over $1 billion, and that derailed the entire package.
Thank you. Mr. Wright.
When it comes to transportation, we need to take a broad spectrum of transportation. We can't just have roads and bridges. While we need to make sure our roads and bridges are safe, we also need to look at other options. We need to increase pedestrian ways. We need to make sure our bike lanes are safe, and yes, we need to make sure we have good mass transit. We have plenty of millennials that don't want to buy cars. My parents don't even want to drive to the cities, but it sure would be nice if they had a different alternative, or a different way to get to the cities. When we look at the growth in Rochester that's anticipated, we have a road and bridges issue because we have bottlenecks coming into our downtown area. So we have to start looking at other options besides roads and bridges. And yes, that means mass transit. But how do you fund all this? The Republican Party is talking about using general funds. That doesn't work, because then you're looking at using funds that are earmarked or used for education and health and human services. We need a specific, dedicated funding stream, which would include using the gas tax, which would include using other alternative means like the tab tax. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll remind the audience that that someone will pick up questions. If you have additional questions, just write them on your card and we'll bring them in. Our next question comes from the audience, and we'll begin with Mr. Wright. If the DMC is such a good thing for Rochester, for the Rochester area, how will it be a benefit to me as a homeowner? Where will the money come from to pay for this effort?
That's a great question. When the DMC was proposed, Mayo Clinic wanted to throw $3 billion into the economic activity and development into our community. As part of that package, they asked the state to help with the infrastructure costs. That's where you hear that $500 million. That was part of the tax package in 2013 that Senator Nelson voted against. How it helps us is this is a unique opportunity. There are not a lot of communities that have the funding up front to actually make good development decisions on a plan looking out 150 years into the future. Most of the time, it's done hodgepodge through zoning and with a lot of variances. And that never works well. So we have a unique opportunity. There are communities across the U.S. that are very jealous of us right now because this just doesn't happen. And part of the goal is to make sure we have civic engagement so that we all can take part, and because this is our community, it's to make our community better. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
Destination Medical Center. That was a bill that I authored along with Senator Senjum. It was a bipartisan bill, and it was bipartisanly supported, and the governor recognized that when he came down and spoke about it. But it ceased to be a bipartisan vote when that few pages of important language for the Destination Medical Center was tucked in to a 660-page tax bill that did increase taxes by $2 billion. And it was damaging, as I have alluded to earlier. So to say that I did not support it is inaccurate. And quite frankly, even to this date, there has been no money sent from the state to the Destination Medical Center. So the assertion that I voted against $525 million is inaccurate. However, it is a good concept. It actually bases state aid, it's called state infrastructure aid, based upon the growth in the economy from when the project started year by year.
Thank you. And we have a rebuttal.
So while Senator Nelson will say she supported it, she didn't. She may have actually supported it initially, but when the rubber hit the road and the floor vote came, she voted no. And that's against our community's interests. That was against jobs, that was against development for our community, and that was because she was playing party politics and followed the Republican Party on that. We know that. Look at the voting record.
And we have a rebuttal. Yes or no?
No, I'll say
Okay.
it.
All right. Our next question from the audience. Being an elected, we're going to begin with Ms. Nelson. Being an elected official isn't easy. You have to come to a decision and vote on so many issues outside of your expertise. And since neither of you is a trained scientist, an economist, or a public health official, you must seek input. When it comes to climate change, how have you been educating yourselves, and what have you learned?
As in climate change, as in every other aspect, I always look at the experts. And you want to talk to the people in the field. You want to talk to experts on both sides of an issue. Quite frankly, usually there's not one side of anything that has a corner on knowledge. It's important to look at the pros, the cons, the advocates, those who are opposed, and I think that helps you draw better conclusions. I also look at data and facts. A lot of times you hear innuendos or motivation or asserting motivation. Don't do that. As legislators, we should look at the facts, we should look at hard data, and we should talk to the experts in the field and question on both sides.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Climate change is real. And before you can even address it, you have to actually recognize that climate change is real. And I'm not even sure Senator Nelson agrees that climate change is a real thing going on right now. I would ask her to answer that question, actually. I know it's real because in the military, this is something the military is deeply concerned about. This is one of the top 5 reasons that our military is game plan. And why is that? Because when the polar ice caps melt, the water goes up, and what do we do about our coastal cities? We have millions and millions of people living in coastal cities that could get flooded very quickly. And how do we make sure people don't panic as we try to have to do a forced removal? So yeah, climate change is real. And you look at the science, and the science tells us it's real. And then that means that we have to actually do something about it. And I guess that's an answer for a different question. But it's real. You look at the scientists. As someone who actually is practicing in the courtroom, I know I rely on experts. I have to hire experts because I know I don't know everything. So I always rely on experts. It's part of what I do as a profession. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next audience question will begin with Mr. Wright. Affordable housing is a major concern for working families. Many spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing. What do you see state legislatures' role in addressing affordable housing? What is the state legislator's role in addressing affordable housing?
We have 2 main issues facing our community. The first issue is we have a worker shortage. We'll be short 20,000 workers in the next 20 years. That means we'll have 20,000 job openings and no one to fill them. The second issue we have is we don't have affordable housing in Rochester. Those of us who live here know this. It's very hard to find a home now. And the city has lost any ability to provide incentives to builders to build affordable housing because the builders make more money in the middle or higher range. So it's not even being built right now. As a state, what we can do is help with like LGA funding or TIF financing to the city so they actually have flexibility to provide incentives to builders to create affordable housing. On the city side, they can also do some ordinance changes to maybe build what in Seattle we call it mother-in-law apartments or homes in the backyards and use some of this green space we have. But there's certainly some things we can do. And this issue is not going to go away because if people can't live here, they're going to move into Dover, Neota, and that's going to start to gum up our roads as they come into work.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
I believe the question was on affordable housing. And what the state could do. The state can do a number of things. One of the ways that we help with affordable housing is significant bonding investments. And I have voted for those each and every year. $80 million of bonding for affordable housing, $100 million of bonding for affordable housing. That's one element. But I think we are short-sighted if we don't also look at really what's the real issue here. Let's help people be able to earn a better living. Let's make sure that they have the education and the skills for the jobs that exist today. Rich mentioned the workforce shortage. One of the things we can do is the pipeline project, which I was a co-sponsor of, bipartisan. Actually, almost all my bills are bipartisan. I've heard more partisan language here at this table tonight than I think I have in the Minnesota Senate, quite frankly. But we should make sure people have affordable salaries, that they have skills for the jobs today, and the state still has an avenue in that affordable housing bonds, and I will continue to support those, just like I have in the past.
Thank you. You touched on education. Our next question is about education. We'll begin with Ms. Nelson. What is your position on providing K-12 funding tied to inflation, and what is your position on school vouchers?
2 questions there. K-12 funding. As you might know, I am a former teacher both at the elementary and the secondary level here in Rochester. I know that education is the great equalizer. It's the moral issue of our day. It's the economic issue of our day. And it is the just issue of our day. We must stop admiring this largest in the nation achievement gap that we have. That's why I have supported historic funding in education. I also support making sure that we keep best teachers in their classrooms and that all students have an option to go to the school that they feel is best for them or that their parents feel is the best for them. We need to have strong public schools. We need to invest in them. I have done that, but we also need to offer reforms. We cannot just say more money. We need to offer reforms like my early literacy initiative, which has been helpful to make sure that kids are reading on grade level by the end of grade 3.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Senator Nelson's right that education is a moral issue and it's a value. I was raised in a household where we put a premium on education, and that's why I value it so much. But for Senator Nelson to say it's a value, I don't believe that she believes it is as much as a value as she tells you. And the reason is in 2013 or 2012, in order to balance the budget deficit, she took all of the money out of our schools to balance the deficit. Left our schools with nothing. What does that say about your values if you leave our schools to K through 12 with nothing? I think that speaks volumes. I won't do that. I swear I will never do that and make that promise here. Now when it comes to actually funding K through 12, we need to increase our funding because we're dead last in the nation on support service funding. We're also dead last, we're 49th out of 50 states in guidance counselor to student ratio. And it's having a negative impact on the education our children are receiving. Because we have to put the funding there because the kids need the help in order to graduate. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. You know, one of the first things we learn in the Senate and in the legislature is you talk about facts, you talk about your policy positions, you do not cast aspersions or assign motivation. In fact, had Attorney Wright done that in the Senate, he would have been reprimanded. You cannot do that. You focus on the policy. It's also good to know what you're talking about. Rich Wright said that the balanced budgeting measure of slowing down payments to schools left the schools with nothing. He said that twice. Let's set the record straight. That was $13 billion, over $13 billion to our K-12 schools in the very year that he said they were left with nothing. I think it's important that candidates have their facts correct when they speak.
Thank you. Our next question is on a very different subject. We will begin with Mr. Wright. Minnesota's Safe Harbor Act, dealing with sex trafficking, became a model for federal legislation. What do you see as the major benefit of the law for Minnesota and the major shortcoming? Would you support ongoing funding?
Yes, I would support ongoing funding in order to provide the safe harbor and the sex trafficking. Sex trafficking in Minnesota, I don't know if you guys know this, but the Mall of America is one of the main targeting areas to find sex traffickers. And that's where we lose a lot of our children to the sex trafficking world. So it makes sense for us in this state to be on the front lines here because it's hitting us hard here at home. I actually have clients who's lost daughters to this. This is something we need to continue to work for. Yes, we need to keep funding in order to make safe harbors because victims of sex trafficking, they're victims. They're not, they should not be criminalized for what they're being forced to do, and that's wrong.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
Thank you for the question. That is a very serious question and a great concern to us. It's hard to think that Minnesota is one of the capitals of this horrendous practice. Yes, I support the Safe Harbor Act that was a model for national legislation. I was a co-sponsor of that bill. I was honored for doing so. I think I might have been only one of the Republicans that authored that bill. It was important. It was a national leader. Not only did I support that and author that legislation, I also supported funding the next year to increase the funding for the Safe Harbor Act. And let me tell you what it does. I think that was the question. And why it's important is because that national leading legislation that I authored, sponsored with Democrat Sandy Pappas, actually did a wonderful thing. It treated the young girls as victims instead of criminals. And it increased the penalties on the real criminals, which were the Johns and those who bought those services. And our county attorney here has done a wonderful job leading on this issue as well. Olmsted County has been a leader in this. tracking down.
Thank you. Excuse me, the next question is also kind of a two-part question regarding legislative rules. We'll begin with Ms. Nelson. Would you limit the number of bills a legislator can introduce during a session? And how would you get the legislature to get back on track by keeping bills focused on a single issue?
It's a great question. Number one, would I limit legislators' ability to offer bills? No, I would not, because I believe that would be limiting their constituents' input. However, to get the legislature back on track regarding single subject bills, and I have stood up on the Senate floor and argued for this. Let's obey, let's live within what our Constitution says. Our Constitution says we must have single subject bills. Let me tell you what happened this year in the Senate. Over 900-page finance bill that included every department funding in Minnesota state government. It's that type of broken process that we need to heal. I have been a leader in calling for these transparency and accountability measures, including my initiative to end last-minute lawmaking. We need to enact a deadline that requires the conference committees to come together a week before the deadline, not in the last 15 minutes of session.
Thank you. Mr. Wright.
I would not limit the number of bills that a legislature can introduce. I would leave that up to that particular legislature to decide if he or she has the ability to, represent and sponsor and do the work needed on those bills. That there's a lot of energy that's going to be spent on doing that, and we all have different amounts and can handle that differently. As far as the single issue, get on backtrack onto the single issue, I mean, when you're talking like an omnibus bill, they have a ton of issues in an omnibus bill. And they're there for a reason, because it makes it more efficient. Some of the hot topic issues, and I guess I wonder if that's what the questioner's getting at, if some of these hot topics that are single issues, if they're looking for carve-outs. For example, the DMC, that was part of a tax bill, right? But included in that were other projects, some for the Mall of America, some for 3M. So it's difficult to change a process that's actually been happening and working. Well, all we really need is to send legislatures up there who know how to work together to get things done.
Thank you. Our next question will begin with Mr. Wright. Would you support a religious liberty bill similar to ones in Indiana and North Carolina that would allow businesses to turn away LGBT Americans and would prevent transgender persons from using the bathrooms of their choice?
No. This is one of the civil rights issues of our time. For the last 100 to 200 years, transgender people have been using the bathroom of their choice without any incidents of assaults in those bathrooms. Because I guarantee you, if there was, it'd be all over YouTube, right? It would have been promoted by people. That's not the case. That's not happening. In fact, the reverse happens. The #1 victims of assault in our community are the LGBTQ plus community. So these bathroom bills have they have the exact opposite result than what they're intended. They make it very unsafe for transgender people, because it forces transgender people into a circumstance where they're more likely to be assaulted. And that's according to the police reports. So what I would say is no, I would not support that bill. And I would support the right of people to use the bathroom that they feel that they identify with.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
Well, I cannot speak to the Indiana bill. I have not seen those religious liberty bills, but I can speak to you about Minnesota and the state of Minnesota and the bills that came before the Minnesota Senate. And they were called bathroom bills, quite frankly. And the issue was, what should our school districts do to protect the privacy of all students? And in Minnesota, our school districts have told us loudly and clearly that these are individual issues with individual students in very different settings as far as what type of bathroom or locker rooms there are. And our school districts have assured us that they can determine at the local level how best to protect the privacy of each and every student. I do believe that is far superior than the state of Minnesota or the federal government coming in and trying to determine that. It is a very individual issue, and it is also very pertinent to the specific area. That's why I was one of 3 Republicans who voted against that bathroom bill in the state of Minnesota. I believe our local school districts can best handle how best to protect every student's privacy. That'd be a good model for the rest of the state as well.
Thank you. Next question, beginning with Ms. Nelson, is on gun violence. What are your proposals to reduce gun violence in Minnesota?
Well, I think gun violence is a serious issue. 60% of suicides are via gun violence. I think there's a lot of things that we can do. One, we should enforce the gun laws that we currently have on the books. Secondly, we need to do a better job of mental health services in this state. Many of the issues have to do around untreated mental illness. I'll just take an aside. That's why I was glad the Excellence in Mental Health bill, another bipartisan bill of which I was a co-sponsor, passed this year. It will revolutionize how we deliver mental health services in this state. Those are 2 key things we can do to reduce gun violence. I also believe that we need to do a better job using the NICS system, which is an IT system that so we can do a better job of keeping guns out of the hands of those who should not have them. And we should use the technology that we currently have in place better to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Wright?
So the gun violence issue has hit us pretty hard this last year. And every year when you take a look at the suicide rates, it hits us even harder because it's one of the #1 cause. People who commit suicide are pretty effective when they use a gun. But there's some things we should be doing, and they're common sense things. For example, if you're so dangerous you can't fly an airplane, you probably shouldn't have a weapon. That's common sense. The other thing is, and every time a weapon moves from one person to another person, there should be a background check done. As someone who, I don't know, many of you probably know I served in the military. I'm a sharpshooter on the M16 and the 9mm. I know what these weapons do. We have to be careful that they don't fall into the wrong hands. And there are some common sense things that we can do and that we should be doing and should have done already, but we haven't.
Thank you. I think I'll take one more question before your closing statements. Yeah, it won't be a little one, but we're going to begin with Mr. Wright. HMOs in Minnesota get $5 billion a year of state money. They're not subject to comprehensive and independent audits to ensure they aren't overpaid. What will you do to protect taxpayers' money from overcharges and mistakes?
I don't think I know quite enough about this, but my initial reaction would be to do an audit. It's not that hard. Just do an audit to make sure our state funds are being used wisely. That's what most companies do. That's what we did when I was in-house, and to me that makes sense.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
Oh, exactly. There should be an audit. There ought to be transparency. I believe this is what has been called the black box. Nobody really knows what happens there. And whenever we use taxpayer money, we need to have the light of sunshine. And I think we need to have full transparency. That is an issue that should be addressed.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the time of finishing up with the closing audience questions, and we're ready for closing statements. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for their closing statement, and Ms. Nelson will go first.
Thank you. It's great to lead off here as well. Let me just say a couple general things that I was not really able to address in our questions tonight. As you noticed, I think it's one of the important things for a legislator is to know what their jurisdiction is. So my opponent talked about federal jurisdiction and Supreme Court cases, and he also talked about the no-fly zone, the no-fly piece, that of course is federal legislation as well. Then he also went all the way down to the local level and started talking about zoning issues for things like what we call granny flats. But I think as a state legislator, it's important to know where your jurisdiction is, and that is on working on the things for the people of the state of Minnesota that come under the umbrella of state government. Those things that I would be taking with me to the Capitol, my priorities for the next legislative session include lowering health insurance costs. I've had several bills that would reform MNsure, provide more choice for people choosing insurance, although they did not get hearings, but I will continue to push for those things. We need to stabilize the small group and individual market. We need fair and equitable funding for all of our schools, specifically those in greater Minnesota. We do need that long-term transportation plan. It should be sustainable and it should be dedicated. We need a tax bill similar to the one that the governor vetoed, which provided tax relief for low and middle class families, college students, veterans, small businesses, local businesses, farmers, cities and counties. Those are all things that my opponent said he would have voted against. And let me say that bill was not a surprise, that $100 million error, which by the way was only the accurate number if the legislature never came in and fixed it. That was discussed in the Senate Tax Committee. We wanted to change the word to the correct word, which is and instead of or, but the Senate Tax Chair said, no, we don't want to do that here. So to say that people didn't know what was in here was not correct. Finally, I would continue to advocate for the Rochester Reading Center, the RCTC project, and the completion of the Chester Woods Trail. I authored and voted for each of these things, which was not only in the Senate bonding bill, which I was able to vote for. Unfortunately, I was the only Republican to do that, and I say that because it's the importance of bipartisanship. I think we didn't hear as much as I would like tonight, but that's what we need at the Capitol, is working together, working across party lines. Okay. I've done that.
Thank you. Mr. Wright?
Thank you everyone for coming to listen to us tonight and to participate. Thanks to the League of Women Voters, Post Bulletin, and the Chamber of Commerce for hosting. And I guess based on what Senator Nelson just said, I don't know what shocks me more. Either that the tax bill was passed without knowing that there was a $100 million mistake, or that she consciously voted for a bill knowing there was a $100 million mistake. Now I'm going to totally change gears. This election is like nothing we have seen. This election is about our values from across the board. We have a presidential election going on now that is shocking. We have a candidate that started his campaign by vilifying Mexicans as rapists. We have a president who's running for a campaign who encourages violence against minorities at his rallies. We have a president running for a campaign who said awful things about women just this last week, and as a former prosecutor, has admitted to conduct that means he should register as a sex offender in our state. And he wants to be president? This speaks volumes. I was born and raised here. These are not my values. These are not the values of my community at all. And what's more disappointing to me is, hey, I give Mitt Romney credit. He stood up against this right out of the gate. But not a single local Republican candidate has said, no, this is wrong. Not a single one has disavowed him, disowned him, unendorsed him. This is wrong. It is wrong. It's wrong on multiple levels. These are not our values. I've never had an election like this. I don't think any of us recall an election like this. And I would ask you to vote Democrat this year, because the values that are coming down from the Republican Party are not the values of our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I use a rebuttal?
Yes.
Let's clarify this. You know, this is a national election like none of us have ever seen. Let's face the facts. We have the two most unliked candidates in the history of our nation running against one another. And you're all going to sort that out, okay? Let me just say, the race I'm interested in is the third race on your ticket. It is the bottom left-hand corner. You can vote any way you want on any races. That's what we can do in our country. You vote Republican one place, Democrat another, and they are secret ballots, and they should be. Those were hard fought for rights in our country.
Thank you. We're going to take a brief break while we turn the room over slightly. We'll begin again in about 6 minutes. Thank you.